morning. It is another Sunday morning with our Odessa Wesleyan Church Chronicle Bible study, a journey through the Bible. And we're looking at Genesis chapter 28. We're going to start at verse 10. So we remember from last week that Jacob and his mother, but mainly Jacob, conspired, deceived his father Isaac to give him the blessing of inheritance that was actually due to his brother Esau. And this was because of the prophecy, the promise that God had given Rebekah while the two boys were in the womb, that Jacob would be, instead of being the second child, he would be the elder. He would become the leader. He would become the inheritor. So at the end of this, we can understand Esau's great anger, and we talked about this a little bit last week about how Esau was so angry at his brother that he was planning his murder, but he would wait until after his father had passed away. Because after that, nobody could really challenge his inheritance during his father's life. If Esau had murdered his brother, then his father, still as the leader of the family group, would cast Esau out and find another heir. So Rebekah goes to her husband and she uses the excuse to him that she's disappointed in her eldest son, that he married a woman not from their people group, from their culture, probably not even really from their language, certainly not from their religion. That since Esau didn't do that, she said to Isaac that if Jacob does that, it'll just break my heart. Send him away, send him back to my brother's home, and let him find a wife. Now, if you look in most Bibles, you have a map, and if you see where they are, that's almost a 600, 900-mile journey, depending. Straight line, it's about 600 miles, but I'm pretty sure he didn't travel through the desert on foot, for months at a time. So probably a 900-mile journey that he went away, far enough away from Esau to let things simmer down. So this is where we're picking up today in chapter 28, verses 10 through 15. So Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he had reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on earth, with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending upon it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land from which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west, to the east, to the north, to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you, and I will watch over you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Now, reading those words, does that sound familiar to us? Yeah. That if we go back, the words that was said to Abraham was said to his son Isaac, and now it's being said to Abraham's grandson, Jacob, that you will inherit this land and you'll be a father of many people. Now, that was quite the difference of experience, because up until this point, God spoke, but it doesn't say that Abraham nor Isaac actually saw God. But here Jacob sees God, sees the angels, he sees heaven literally open up, physically appeared to him. And I think the reason why God chose that, and it's kind of hard to why did God do that? But this is just me, not, biblical. Is that Jacob, basically is now an outcast. He's basically away from his family. He, tried to do a dirty deed and got caught at it. His brother, even after, his father gave the blessing to Isaac, his brother, you know, you know, his murderous intent, that now Jacob is fleeing from this to people that he's heard about through his mother, but, has never met. And so I think God had to appear to him to really solidify, basically, in essence, the message is, you will come back to this land. I will bring you back, and you will be blessed through it. And I think the most important thing here, we talk a lot about Abraham and we talk a lot about Isaac and how they're going to be this father of many, many nations. And we've seen that, through the list of Abraham's descendants and, how many children they had and how many children their children had, and different names in there, which will be very important as we continue our study. In a couple books down the road, you'll start seeing these people groups, these families, these descendants of Abraham interact with other descendants of Abraham, which we would call the people of Israel. But more important, that God promised his presence, that no matter where Jacob was going, no matter what his circumstances was, God is with you. And I think that's a great message, especially, while we still, are kind of in the afterglow of Easter, that is the message that we have. That even though your circumstances and you're following God and you're doing what you think's right, or even if you sinned and you messed up, God's still with you. He still wants a relationship with you. His presence will go with you. He will work through you. It doesn't give us permission to do what we want, but the times in our frail humanity when we fall or we suffer from other people's mistakes, God is still with us. He will still bless us with his presence. So let's move, bless you. Let's move down to verse 16 here. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. So early in the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called the place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. Then Jacob made a vow. If God be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God. And this stone I have set up as a pillar will be God's house. And all that you give me, I will give you a tenth. So look at Jacob's reaction. He could have said, well, of course God's going to bless me because he promised my mother when I was still in the womb that I was going to be a blessed person. And he promised my father and he promised my grandfather, of course God's going to bless me. Of course God's going to be with me. But look at his reaction. He was humble. The man who tried to grasp everything and then lost it realized that God's word is true. That God appeared to him in such a unique way that had been done since Adam and Eve. That literally, if our study to this point, realize that this is the very first mention of God physically appearing to somebody after Adam and Eve. That's kind of unique that, Jacob is, for some reason, in his young life is somebody special to God. So he set up a testimony by erecting a monument. Pillars or obelisks would be carved out of a stone and they would have writing on it explaining what it represented. See, there wasn't written history at this time. It was still oral tradition being passed down. People of the time would set up a monument, and then their children would say, "What does this monument, represent?" And so Jacob could point when he came back to the land, and this is where God appeared to me. This is the city of Bethel, God's house. And this is what God's promise was to be, and then passed on to my people. Now, we may think, well, that's a little strange to do. Have we ever heard of the Washington Monument? Jefferson Monument? Grant's Tomb? Mount Vernon? See, as human beings, we set up, even though all the things I just mentioned were created after written historical records were made, we still, as human beings, we set up monuments to remind us. Out here, in front of our church, we have a stone garden that we've asked people in the community, people from the church, to paint rocks, and we write verses on them to remind us of certain things. And so this isn't something abnormal. This is something that human beings have done for a long time. That if there was ever an argument of whose land this is or where really was Bethel, the people of Israel could go and say, right here, this is the stone pillar that Jacob erected. Now, the city of Bethel is going to become important throughout the further study here of the Bible. That Bethel would eventually become the religious and political center of Israel. That when the people of Israel would come back from their slavery in Egypt and come into the land that was promised finally, that they had an ark, they had a tabernacle, which was basically a large tent as the representative of their house of God. Where it finally had its final resting place was at Bethel. Kind of unique. That the place that Jacob called the house of God, where God appeared to me, became one of the holy places to the people of Israel. So, chapter 29 through 30, we see that Jacob arrives at his ancestral home. He's welcomed by his family, and he is love struck. The very first person that he meets from this family is Rebecca, one of his uncles, or Rachel, I'm sorry. Yeah, there's too many R's there. Rachel, excuse me. That he meets Rachel, and eventually he is welcomed into Laban's house as a long-lost relative. They make an agreement that he wants to work for him. They make another agreement. He goes, I want to marry one of your daughters. Well, Laban kind of tricked him a little bit. He ends up marrying the oldest daughter. And then he works another 7 years, so 14 years. Because again, here's Jacob, and you would give a dowry, a gift to the your bride's family, to marry her. Excuse me. But Jacob didn't have anything. Had his name, and that was it. So he made an agreement to be, work for Laban for 14 years for both of his daughter's hands. So he eventually, through his wives, and again, because remember we talked about the situation with Sarah, how Sarah gave Abraham a concubine, one of her slaves, to have a child, and that's how Ishmael came about. That both the daughters, through competition and issues of not being able to have children, give a female slave, each of them, to Jacob as a wife. He eventually has 12 sons and a daughter, large family. He becomes prosperous. He then, Laban sees that and knows that probably he's a little bit disgruntled, and he says, well, you know what, why don't you now, you've worked off having, the dowries of both of my daughters, why don't you actually, earn something? So they make an agreement. And, you know, Jacob says to want the, I'll take as my wages the sheep and the goats who are not fully pure white, fully gray. I want the ones that have kind of birthmarks on them, spotted or streaked. Now, Laban says, sure, because that's very rare when you have a flock of white sheep. I grew up on a farm where we raised cows, and we had heifers, which were naturally the black and white cows you see, that you would hardly ever see a calf born that wasn't black and white spotted. Once in a while, you'd have maybe through genetics and whatnot, you'd have a cow that maybe would be red tinged or brown. But majority of the time, if you had Holsteins as your herd, that you would have cows that look like Holsteins. So Laban's like thinking, I'm getting off easy here because once in a while, you know, that we want the good sheep. We want the sheep that are pure white with the best wool because the white wool could be dyed a lot better. That, and it was also again the thinking that the ones that did not have the streaks in their fur, the spots in the fur, they were the stronger ones. That they didn't understand genetics back there, but they kind of said. So Jacob said, "Yeah, that's what I want." So Laban said, "Sure." Well, what Jacob did was he figured out something that when it came time for the animals to mate, how to keep the certain colors, allow them, to mate together, but then to keep them away from the ones that were more the pure white. So all of a sudden, after another 6 years, Jacob's prosperity, his herds, became larger than Laban's. And Laban's trickery, he wasn't getting away with. All of a sudden, he's like, wait a second, I've been deceived by the deceiver. And again, because we go back to Laban, that he promised Rebecca and produced the other daughter. I'm sorry, I just lost the name. So he tried to outwit Jacob, but what does Jacob do? He outwits Laban. Well, Laban's sons go, wait a second here. This foreigner steals our sisters. No, not quite, but when people get upset and mad, we kind of bend the truth a little bit. He's stealing from our father. Look at how prosperous he is. They had a fear that maybe one, Laban would make Jacob the heir, the head of the tribe, or two, they would come out with very little. And I'm pretty sure these guys were well off, you know. But again, human nature and our greed, we want what the other guy has, even if we have enough of that, we still want more. So Jacob pulled his herds, his family, a distance away from Laban. Still a problem, still a tension there. God appeared again to Jacob and said, it's time for you to go home. It's time for you to move your family there. So Jacob went to Laban and said, you know what? It's been 20 years. It's time for me to return home. Thank you for the start of life I've had. I'm going to go. Would you like to, give a blessing to your grandchildren and, your daughters, because you may never see them again while you live on this earth, right? No. The deceiver part of him that hadn't been conquered yet kicked in. He moved his family again with probably the idea that he passed around. I'm going to move 3 days away because there's a lot of tension here. Well, the problem was that the 3 days wasn't towards the better pasture land. It was towards the desert, towards the area where you wouldn't go unless you were starting out on a journey. He was walking on the trade routes. Now, the time to come together as a tribal group happened, and Laban realized, where is my son-in-law? Where's my daughters? Where's my grandchildren? So he starts asking around and finds out, well, we saw this large group traveling down route whatever. And other people say, well, I heard that, he's on his way home. And you can understand that Laban was not happy about this. So much not happy that he gathers together his army, because again, these tribes were large enough that they had their own warriors. It chases down Jacob. I think for a couple of reasons. One, how dare you? Because he still probably thought there was some way he could benefit from Jacob. Two, Jacob's a part of his tribe. He's supposed to go to the tribal leader to ask permission to branch off, even to go on a journey. And that is why, again, remember back, Isaac, was blessed by his father and said, "Hey, go get a wife. Go to Laban's territory. Go get a wife." So you had to ask permission from the leader of your family group to do anything. Not just, he wasn't just the dad; he was the head of what was your political, cultural, religious, life. So, Laban's probably a little ticked off about that, but then he discovers his household gods. Now, this may be a little confusing to us because Laban talks about Jacob's God is the same God he worships. Again, Laban was a descendant of um, Abraham's family that was called from Ur. And Laban's father decided to stay. He stayed and settled in the area, and Abraham's family continued to travel south. So they serve the same God, but then what is it? Gods. Well, the word gods here can mean a couple different things. That it could be statues, it could be idols that they worshiped, but it had two different things. That they were symbols of authority, that they may not necessarily have been worshiping them, but it was a symbol that I'm in charge. The person who held on to these symbols of the family group was the leader. Have, all of a sudden they're missing. So Laban goes, that kid Jacob, he steals my daughters, which he didn't, but that's kind of his thinking. He steals the goats and the sheep from me. He just stole my grandchildren from my presence. Now he's stealing the authority. Well, Jacob didn't know anything about this. His wife did it. Because I think Rebecca was thinking that, maybe she didn't have a concept of how far they were traveling. Or maybe even Jacob, didn't really tell her that. I think that she wanted the show, again, human beings trying to make, you know, things work out, that God promised on their own. That she said, well, my husband's now the tribal leader. He needs those symbols. So Laban tracked down Jacob, and they had quite the intense argument. Fortunately, it didn't come to blows. But God appeared to Laban just before he caught up to Jacob traveling. And God said, leave him alone. I have blessed him. That let him go. So Laban expressed his right to bless his grandchildren and his daughters, which he did. He was given permission, but never found these symbols of authority that Rebecca had hidden. And he sends him on his way. But notice something here. Look at verses 46, or verse 46. This is Laban speaking. Come now, let us make a covenant, you and I. Let it serve as a witness between us. Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. He said to his relatives, gather some stones. So they took stones and piled them in a heap, and they ate there by the heap. Laban called it Jerag Sahatha, and Jacob called it Gilead. Laban said, this heap is a witness between you and me today. That is why it is called Gilead. It's also called Mizpah, because he said, may the Lord keep watch between you and me when we are away from each other. If you mistreat my daughters, or if you take any wives besides my daughters, even though no one is with us, God, remember that God is a witness between us. And Laban also said to Jacob, "Hear this heap, and here is this pillar I have set up between you and me. This heap is a witness, and this pillar is a witness. I will not go past this heap and your side to your side to harm you, and you will not go past this heap and pillar to my side to harm me. May the God of Abraham, the God of their father, judge between us." So Jacob took an oath in the name of the father of his name of the fear of his father Isaac. He offered sacrifice there in the hill country and invited his relatives to a meal. After they had eaten, they spent the night there. And early the next morning, Laban kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them. Then he left and returned home. Notice again, another pillar, another marker. This was again witness, and it was also setting a border. To the north, that's Laban's land. To the south, that's Jacob's land. You want to have trade, that's fine, but your people can't go past this as far as their homes. You will not take up arms and fight against anybody to the north. And I promise you that my people, this is the limit of where they will expand. They will not go farther south. So this name eventually changed. Now you say, again, people would bring up why they have issues with the Bible. Well, the names are different. Well, 4,000 years later, yes, names change. That right down the road, we have this beautiful place that we call Watkins Glen. It wasn't called Watkins Glen. I just lost the name. Remember what it was called? Nope, I can't either. We have this other place right below us at the end of 224 called Montour Falls. Up until the 1800s, it was called Catherinestown. So names change. Where we're living, this used to be called New Amsterdam, and now it's called the state of New York. So this country we live in used to be the colonies of the United States, or the colonies of England. And now it's called the United States of America. So names change as language changes, people groups change, names change. So to say, well, the Bible says it's this place, but now, it's we can't find that on the map. Well, of course not, because 4,000 years later. But that's why the writer here of Genesis, that even Laban's calling it one thing, Jacob's calling it something different. And then the writer puts in there, it's also called Gilead. So that was a familiar name to the people. What this would become is the northeast border of the nation of Israel, that the very farthest northeast that you could go. So I threw some other questions down. I just got ahead of myself. So I answered question number 1. So let me go down here. Another question is here that people bring up sometimes when they do this thing called biblical critique is, why did it seem that Jacob and Laban used different names in different languages? Again, you have a people group 900 miles away. They understood each other, but why did they use different names of things and say different things? That Jacob was using what would eventually evolve into linguistically Hebrew. And Laban was using this language called Aramaic, because eventually, a few generations down the road, the people where Abraham came from, that his uncle Nahor and his nephew Laban and their descendants, they would be called Armenians. And they would become different tribal groups. They weren't really a nation. You couldn't really find nation of Armenia. Back again, our 20th century wisdom in politics, we tried to create a nation called Armenia. But that was the very first time we seen this. Up until this area, if you look again geographically, around Turkey, northern Iraq, and Iran, you would see historical data showing this people group, Armenians. They spoke a language called Aramaic. And Aramaic, actually, even though the Armenians, kind of came in and out of history and faded off to basically more of a nomadic tribe that moved places, really didn't have a physical capital and a physical nation boundary. Their language became extremely, well, it would be used, it would up until the very time of Jesus. Become the and political language, the diplomatic language, the trade language of the people. From around this time, 1300 BC, to about 200 BC, when Greek would start to come in. But it was so prominent that when we read the New Testament, Jesus knew Aramaic. That some of the things that he says there is in Aramaic. The early Bible was the early writings of the disciples, the Gospels, and some of Paul's letters were written most likely in Aramaic and also Greek. So this language had an influence. And again, Jacob's dialect really had very much the same linguistic roots, but they were called dialects. Now, again, that seems a little confusing and weird, and that could be a great, that's a nice little expression. All right, hop on a plane, fly to England, and start talking to the very first English person you see. You can understand them, right? But if you ask about where's the elevator, they're going to look at you cross-eyed but if you say where's the lift, they're going to take you to an elevator. If you go into a restaurant and you order fish with some French fries, they're going to say, well, we'll give you some fish. Would you like chips instead? Guess what chips are? Fries. If that English person came the a restaurant here in America and ordered fish and chips, they would kind of look funny because why is there French fry? Why is there a bag of chips? With my fish, I wanted chips. Well, that's chips. You didn't say so. I brought you some Doritos. Some chips. My point is, we all speak English. Even go down south, even not even way down the deep south. Go a few miles from here we are in Odessa to people living in Pennsylvania. We have different names for the same meaning. We all speak with an accent, except for us New Yorkers. We actually speak American, right? The first time I hit that was when I was preteen. We went to Arkansas to visit family, and my cousins who were born in New York, but they lived more of their lives in Arkansas and had this beautiful accent. But they looked at me and said, "You talk funny." I'm like, "What do I talk funny? You're from New York." "No, we're not. We're from Arkansas." "No, you started in New York." So you adapt to the language and the way of speaking. So that's what's happening here. That Jacob people group is going to be more the dialect of Hebrew. And Laban's people group is going to be using more of the Aramaic. So that's why we see, again, different names, different words. And again, when another critique of biblical experts sometimes they have of the Bible is, well, we can't find this guy's name in there. That you actually need to realize, again, are you looking for the English side, Anglicized, whatever you want to call it, name for that person? Or are you going back 4,000 years ago to their dialect, how they said things, how they pronounce things? And what are you using? It's the very same thing of here in 2024. We can't look back 2024 years ago and expect those people to understand what the eclipse is that's going to happen tomorrow. Then they thought it was some kind of because certain people groups worship the moon and worship the sun. The gods must be fighting or they must be angry with us or this is some kind of sign in the sky. Today we would kind of laugh at that and say, well, no, we would have a scientific explanation. We kind of, look down about it. All of us sitting in the room, hasn't been so long ago that we took this little camera, our little computer, and we're able to talk to somebody in Africa live. That somebody in California right now can see our Bible study. Wasn't really that long ago, folks. So think about if somebody told you that 20, 30 years ago, what would be your reaction? Sure. Uh-huh. Yeah, maybe, maybe, yeah, sure. Okay, we would see this. This would be fiction in a movie. Now think about yourself sitting here. Right. Right. But when you think about now take ourselves here with our technology and look back at ourselves 30, 40, 50 years ago. So we need to understand that just 5 decades, again, when we are examining, 20 centuries, of time, that things are different. So we need to keep that in mind. We need to, when we study history, the worst mistake we make is try to interpret history through our present history. We need to interpret history through the time and the age that we're in. Get off that soapbox. So we come to the point Jacob reaches the outskirts of his homeland in chapter 32. Being the smart guy he was, could you imagine? Again, let's just say we know he had 12, eventually 12 sons. One of them was born during the journey there. So let's say 10 adult sons. And we'll be generous that each of those 10 sons had 10 sons. And then, of course, we have servants and laborers and flocks and herds. This was a large, large group. Let's even say we'll be conservative, 1,000 people. 1,000 people, 1,000 animals put together. And now you're coming home. You've been pretty prosperous for 20 years. You buried your mother. Your father's still very, very elderly, but still alive. That this guy who stole your birthright just sent messengers into your camp and said he's coming home. We've all probably been in situations where we've had the black sheep of a relative and they want to come over for Christmas or for a holiday. We know the tension, that could happen. Think of the tension that could happen here. Jacob and Esau. Is there going to be a war? Is there going to be a battle? Has Esau forgiven and forgotten? What's going to happen? So Esau responds to Jacob's messengers with, okay, I'm going to come meet him. And calls 300 of his best warriors. Not a good sign. I'm going to go out and meet him. So Jacob divides his crew. He sends a gift to Esau, first of all, thinking, good man. Maybe I can bribe him. Maybe I can settle him down with, I'm going to share my prosperity with you. But then he also divides the group. If you look here in verse 7 and 8, in great fear and distress, Jacob divided the people who were with him into 2 groups and flocks, and the herds and the camels well. He thought if Esau comes and attacks one group, the group may escape. But notice what he does next. Kind of does the smart move. And again, being the resourceful guy, he uses his resources and his intelligence. But then look at verses 9 through 12. He prays to God. He's back again in the area where God promised him, in the area of Bethel. And he reminds God of his promise, and he reminds God that I'm going to be obedient to you. And I ask that you fulfill your promise, that you continue to bless me. So we need to realize that in times of stress and times of that we need to obey God, but we also need to connect with him. We need to still pray to him. And we still need to trust him. That living a Christian life isn't just sitting around on our butts and waiting for God to do something. And living the Christian life isn't picking it up because it all depends on me and doing everything myself. It's a balance. It's a balance of obedience and listening to God and following him and trusting him. So let God this week speak to you. Go to him in prayer. Ask him to show you where he wants you and what he wants you to do in your life. You'll be amazed at the results. Then allow him to give you the strength and the power to carry it out. Let's close in prayer. Thank you, Lord, that you are with us. Whether we're in the desert, fleeing from all that's precious to us because of the mistakes we made, whether we're someplace where it's uncomfortable and different from where we grew up, whether we're traveling back to try to make amends in our family, whether we're standing in your holy presence listening to the great blessing and love that you have, you are with us. We ask that you remind us of that, and those of us who are listening to this message, may they also just take that step of faith and love and trust you. In your name, amen. All right, so next week we're going to continue on there in chapter 32, and we're going to move on into 37. And somebody asked me this week, are you going to be able to do this in 2 years? I don't know. Things are going to move a little bit faster when we, after we get through Genesis and Exodus. You're going to see how quickly we move through a lot of things. So, if we're thinking we're dragging this out, we're not. But thank you very much, and yeah, in the future we're going to be doing online. So, the Sunday before Memorial Day, we will be um, going live, kind of different. So we'll explain that as we get going. All right, you have a good day. Goodbye.